box of socks sat on my kitchen counter like a cruel joke, their price tag still visible through the thin tissue paper. $10.99 from the clearance rack at Walmart. The polyester blend felt scratchy against my fingertips as I lifted them from their cardboard prison, and the beige color reminded me of everything bland and forgettable in this world. Meanwhile, across town in the affluent Riverside district, my daughter's mother-in-law was probably already displaying her Mother's Day gift from my own daughter Sarah, a stunning diamond tennis bracelet worth $10,000 that sparkled like captured starlight. The contrast burned in my chest like acid reflux after bad Chinese takeout, each breath making the injustice more real. Hit subscribe and tell me your state. Does this happen everywhere? I'd raised Sarah for 28 years, sacrificing my own dreams to put her through college, working double shifts at Murphy's Diner until my feet screamed and my lower back ached with permanent damage. But apparently all that love and sacrifice was worth exactly $10.99. Sarah had arrived at my small duplex that Sunday morning with her usual bright smile, but something felt different in the way she embraced me. Her hug was quick and perfunctory, like she was checking an obligation off her mental list rather than greeting the woman who'd sung her to sleep every night for years, who'd held her hair back during stomach bugs, who'd stayed up until 3 a.m. helping with science fair projects that needed to be perfect. She was wearing that expensive Chanel No. 5 perfume her mother-in-law had bought her for Christmas, a scent that cost more than my monthly grocery budget and seemed to announce her elevated social status to anyone within 20 feet. Her hair was styled in that sleek bob from the upscale salon on 5th Street, the kind of place where appointments cost what I made in tips during a busy Friday night shift. The diamond wedding ring Michael had given her caught the morning light streaming through my kitchen window, throwing tiny rainbows across the faded linoleum floor that I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years, but couldn't afford to. When she handed me the small wrapped box, her eyes didn't quite meet mine, focusing instead on the chipped paint around my doorframe. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," she'd said, her voice carrying that artificial cheerfulness people use when they're delivering news they know will hurt, but hope enthusiasm might soften the blow. The gift felt suspiciously light in my hands, and my heart already knew it wasn't the thoughtful present I'd been hoping for. Something that showed she remembered my love for gardening, or my collection of vintage teacups, or the way I'd always dreamed of taking a pottery class. Not like last year, when she'd surprised me with a weekend spa trip to the mountains that made me feel pampered and cherished for the first time in decades. She kept glancing at her phone, and I could see text messages from Michael lighting up the screen with notifications about brunch reservations at the country club and photographer appointments for some family gathering I apparently wasn't invited to. The sinking feeling in my stomach told me this visit was just a pit stop before the real celebration began. A quick duty call before she joined her husband's family for the activities that actually mattered. Her designer handbag sat on my second-hand kitchen table like an expensive rebuke, its leather probably worth more than my monthly rent. I unwrapped the socks slowly, my fingers trembling slightly as the cheap polyester blend revealed itself in all its uninspiring glory. They were beige, the most soul-crushing color in existence, with a small embroidered flower that looked like it had been added by a machine running low on thread and enthusiasm. The fabric felt rough and synthetic, the kind that would make my feet sweat and leave lint in the washing machine. Sarah watched my reaction with the nervous energy of someone who knows they've fallen dramatically short, but hopes that enthusiasm and a bright smile might cover the gap between expectation and reality. "They're from that new boutique downtown," she lied, and we both knew it because the Walmart clearance sticker was clearly visible on the bottom of the box, price checked at 99 cents below the original $12 markup. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with 28 years of birthday breakfasts I'd made at 5 a.m. before heading to work, science fair projects we'd stayed up all night completing with poster board and markers, scraped knees I'd kissed better with infinite patience, and bedtime stories I'd told even when exhaustion made my voice hoarse. All of that history, all of that love, reduced to $10.99 of clearance merchandise. The real knife twist had come the day before, when my neighbor Mrs. Chen excitedly rushed over to show me the photos she'd taken while walking past Harrison's fine jewelry downtown. There was Sarah, hand in hand with Michael, pointing excitedly at a display case filled with diamond bracelets that cost more than I made in 6 months of serving coffee and eggs to truckers and construction workers. The saleswoman, dressed in an elegant black suit that probably cost more than my car, was carefully lifting each piece for their inspection, her white gloves handling the jewelry like precious artifacts. Sarah's face glowed with the kind of joy I hadn't seen directed at me in months, her eyes sparkling almost as much as the diamonds she was examining. Michael was nodding approvingly, his credit card already out and ready, while his perfectly manicured mother stood beside them, offering opinions about which piece would photograph best for social media. They looked like they were planning the surprise of a lifetime, completely absorbed in choosing the perfect symbol of love and appreciation. Mrs. Chen had assumed they were shopping for me and couldn't wait to share the exciting news, not realizing she was actually documenting the moment my daughter chose someone else as her Mother's Day priority. "The bracelet is absolutely stunning," Mrs. Chen had gushed, pulling up the photos on her phone to show me every glittering detail with the enthusiasm of someone sharing genuinely good news. That Mrs. Harrison is so lucky to have a daughter-in-law who loves her that much. $10,000, the saleswoman told them when I was pretending to look at earrings. Can you imagine being loved that much? Each word hit me like physical blows, emphasizing how little my own daughter valued our relationship compared to her need to impress her wealthy in-laws. The bracelet sparkled even in the grainy cell phone photo. Hundreds of perfectly matched diamonds catching the boutique's expensive lighting like a constellation of wealth and status. I forced a smile and pretended to share Mrs. Chen's excitement, making appropriate sounds of amazement and joy, while inside I felt something precious and irreplaceable beginning to crack like old china. The woman who had once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, trembling with fear until I held her close, who had made me Mother's Day cards with glitter and construction paper that I still kept in my dresser drawer, was now spending a fortune to impress someone who barely tolerated my existence and made no secret of considering me inferior. Mrs. Harrison had made her feelings about me crystal clear from the moment Sarah brought Michael home 3 years ago during Christmas break. She came from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for so many generations they considered it a personality trait rather than an accident of birth or stroke of luck. Her own mother lived in a sprawling estate in Westchester County, complete with a tennis court, stables, and gardens that appeared in architectural magazines, while I rented half of a duplex in a neighborhood where the sirens provided the soundtrack and the corner store sold lottery tickets to people chasing impossible dreams. During that first dinner at my kitchen table, Mrs. Harrison's pale blue eyes had catalogued every chipped dish, every second-hand piece of furniture, every sign that we came from different worlds, separated by more than just income. She spoke to me with the polite condescension typically reserved for service workers, technically respectful but unmistakably superior, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when they're being gracious to their inferiors. When Sarah wasn't looking, Mrs. Harrison's carefully maintained mask would slip just enough for me to catch glimpses of the genuine disdain she felt for my polyester work uniforms, my dollar store decorations, and my complete lack of connections to anyone who mattered in her social circle. The transformation in Sarah had been gradual but devastating to watch, like seeing someone you love slowly disappear and be replaced by a polished stranger. She started correcting my grammar at family gatherings, wincing visibly when I pronounced certain words with the working-class accent I'd inherited from my own mother. The daughter who used to raid my closet and borrow my jewelry suddenly developed expensive tastes that required shopping trips to boutiques I couldn't even afford to window shop at, places where a single scarf cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. She began spacing out our phone calls, claiming she was so busy with her new social circle. Mrs. Harrison's friends who attended charity galas, discussed their summer homes in the Hamptons, and treated volunteer work like a competitive sport. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, wondering which version of my daughter would show up. The loving girl I'd raised who used to tell me everything, or the polished stranger Mrs. Harrison was carefully sculpting her into becoming. The worst part was watching Sarah convince herself that she was simply growing and evolving, as if loving me and acknowledging her working-class roots had been phases she needed to outgrow rather than foundations that had made her strong. She'd started using words like sophisticated and refined to describe her new lifestyle, though she never directly criticized mine. The diamond tennis bracelet wasn't just a gift, it was a declaration of war, a carefully orchestrated power play designed to establish the hierarchy in Sarah's affections once and for all. Mrs. Harrison was making it absolutely clear that she could provide Sarah with things I would never be able to afford, experiences I'd never be able to offer, and a lifestyle that required leaving people like me behind in the dust. The $10,000 price tag wasn't chosen randomly. It was specifically calculated to demonstrate the vast, unbridgeable gap between what Mrs. Harrison could offer and what a diner waitress earning minimum wage plus tips could provide. It was psychological warfare disguised as generosity, and Sarah was either too naive to recognize the manipulation or too seduced by the luxury to care about the casualties. Every single diamond on that bracelet represented another way Mrs. Harrison was superior to me. Another reason Sarah should transfer her loyalty, gratitude, and love to her new family while letting her old one fade into insignificance. The message couldn't have been clearer if Mrs. Harrison had taken out a billboard. She was Sarah's future, and I was rapidly becoming her embarrassing past, something to be acknowledged politely but never truly celebrated or honored. The bracelet would photograph beautifully at social events, announcing to everyone in their circle exactly how much Sarah valued her mother-in-law's approval. My sister Janet arrived at my duplex exactly 30 minutes after Sarah left, armed with chocolate chip cookies from the bakery and righteous indignation that had been building for months. She'd been watching this slow-motion betrayal unfold like a car accident, powerless to prevent it, but unable to look away as her younger sister was systematically disrespected and devalued. Janet was everything I wasn't: confrontational where I was diplomatic, financially successful where I struggled, and completely unwilling to watch family members be mistreated without consequences. She owned the most successful real estate agency in 3 counties and had connections throughout the city, including several high-end retail establishments where wealthy families shopped and gossiped. "This stops today, Patricia," she announced, setting the cookies on my counter with the kind of determination usually reserved for war councils or hostile corporate takeovers. Her perfectly styled silver hair and designer business suit made my kitchen look even shabbier by comparison. But Janet had never made me feel inferior about our different circumstances. Instead, she'd always been angry that I didn't demand better for myself. She pulled out her tablet and settled into one of my mismatched kitchen chairs like a general preparing battle plans, her manicured fingers already scrolling through documents and phone contacts. "I've been doing some research on your daughter's precious in-laws," Janet continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd uncovered buried treasure. She pulled up what looked like financial records, legal documents, and newspaper clippings that painted a comprehensive picture of the Harrison family's wealth and its complex conditions. Mrs. Harrison's family money comes with more strings attached than a marionette puppet. Trust fund rules that would make a prison warden proud. Her grandmother's will specifically states that any inheritance can be revoked immediately if the family reputation is damaged by unsuitable associations or public scandal. The old lady was apparently obsessed with maintaining their social standing and made sure future generations would toe the line. She showed me bank statements that revealed Mrs. Harrison's monthly allowance was indeed more than my yearly salary, but it came with behavioral clauses that would make a monk feel claustrophobic. There were requirements for charitable giving, restrictions on public behavior, mandatory family appearances, and most importantly, expectations about the kind of people the family associated with publicly. Janet's investigation had revealed that Mrs. Harrison wasn't just naturally snobbish. She was genuinely terrified of losing her financial security if her family's matriarch disapproved of her choices or associations. The plan Janet outlined was elegant in its simplicity and potentially devastating in its impact, the kind of strategy that could change everything or backfire spectacularly. She had somehow obtained detailed photographs of Mrs. Harrison's Mother's Day gift, including the original purchase receipt she'd acquired through her friend who worked at the jewelry store's corporate office. But more importantly, through her network of real estate clients and social connections, She discovered that Mrs. Harrison had been systematically lying to her own family about Sarah's background for months. Instead of admitting that her daughter-in-law's mother was a working-class waitress who lived paycheck to paycheck, Mrs. Harrison had been claiming Sarah came from modest but respectable circumstances, implying financial stability and social connections that simply didn't exist. Mrs. Harrison's grandmother, the formidable Mrs. Wellington, who controlled the family purse strings, had been asking to meet Sarah's family for months, and Mrs. Harrison kept manufacturing excuses to delay the introduction. "What do you think would happen?" Janet asked, with a wicked smile that reminded me of our childhood pranks. "If Grandmother Wellington learned that her precious granddaughter spent $10,000 on jewelry for herself, while encouraging her daughter-in-law to give that same daughter-in-law's own mother $10 clearance socks?" The question hung in the air between us like dynamite waiting for a match, full of possibility and danger. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that changed the entire trajectory of our family drama. Sarah's voice was tight, with barely controlled panic, and she was clearly trying not to cry as she explained that Mrs. Harrison's grandmother had somehow learned about the Mother's Day gifts and was very upset about the whole situation. The words tumbled out in a rush, punctuated by sniffles and the kind of breathing that comes with genuine distress. Apparently, the formidable Mrs. Wellington had been operating under the impression that Sarah came from a family that valued equality and respect above all else, and the dramatic difference in gift values suggested something quite different about her character and priorities. "She's threatening to cut off Mrs. Harrison's entire trust fund if I don't prove that our family has proper values and treats everyone with dignity," Sarah sobbed into the phone, her voice breaking on the word dignity. In the background, I could hear Michael's voice raised in anger, and Mrs. Harrison's shrill tones defending herself against accusations I couldn't quite make out. "Mrs. Harrison is absolutely furious with me and won't even speak to me right now except to give orders. She says I must have told someone who leaked it to her grandmother, but I swear on my life I didn't tell anyone except—" The line went quiet as the realization hit her like a physical blow. Understanding suddenly dawning that the only person she'd confided in about the gift disparity was me. Mrs. Harrison's voice in the background grew sharp and accusatory, clearly blaming Sarah for the disaster that was unfolding around their carefully constructed social facade. I could hear fragments of their argument floating through the phone. Mrs. Harrison insisting that Sarah must have gossiped to that mother of yours like some common busybody, and Sarah desperately trying to defend both herself and me while obviously failing at both tasks. The conversation was punctuated by the sound of doors slamming and Michael's attempts to mediate between his increasingly hysterical mother and his distraught wife. "Fix this situation immediately, Sarah," Mrs. Harrison demanded loudly enough for me to hear every angry syllable. "Your family's complete lack of class and discretion is going to cost us everything we've worked to build. Maybe it's time you chose between your mother's hurt feelings and our family's future financial security." The ultimatum was delivered with the cold calculation of someone who'd never doubted that money would triumph over maternal love, someone who couldn't imagine that bonds built over decades might be stronger than quarterly trust fund distributions. Sarah was crying harder now, caught between the woman who controlled her husband's family fortune and the mother she'd systematically betrayed, finally understanding that her attempts to please everyone had pleased absolutely no one. The sound of her genuine distress cut through my anger like a knife, reminding me that underneath all the recent changes, she was still the little girl who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. Mrs. Wellington's call came directly to my duplex that afternoon, and her imperious voice filled my small kitchen with the authority of someone accustomed to having her words treated as absolute gospel. She'd obtained my unlisted phone number through methods that spoke to serious money and even more serious connections, and she certainly wasn't calling to exchange pleasantries or make small talk about the weather. "Mrs. Morrison," she began, her New England accent sharp enough to cut glass and educated enough to make me acutely aware of my own dropped consonants. "I believe we need to discuss your daughter's recent behavior and what it reveals about her fundamental character." Her voice carried decades of command, the kind of authority that comes from moving millions of dollars with a signature and watching entire families rise or fall based on her approval. She explained that she'd built her family's considerable wealth through careful investments and strategic marriages, but more importantly, through maintaining relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial manipulation or social climbing. The $10,000 bracelet represented exactly the kind of values she'd spent her lifetime working against, using money as a weapon to hurt people who couldn't defend themselves financially, or as a tool to create hierarchies based on bank accounts rather than character. Her own mother had been a seamstress in Boston before marrying well, she told me, and she understood intimately the pain of being judged by your bank balance rather than your heart, your work uniform rather than your worth as a human being. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000, Mrs. Wellington continued, her voice carrying the kind of matter-of-fact authority that comes from routinely moving mountains with phone calls and check signatures. Not as charity, which would be insulting to both of us, but as an investment in teaching both my granddaughter and your daughter a lesson about authentic relationships and genuine respect. The offer was stunning in its scope and surgical in its precision, designed to force both young women to confront the ugliness of their recent behavior while giving me the resources to rebuild my shattered dignity and pursue dreams I'd deferred for decades. The money came with specific, non-negotiable conditions that had already been drafted by her legal team. Mrs. Harrison's trust fund would be suspended for exactly 1 year while she learned to live on a working person's salary and discovered what real financial pressure felt like. Sarah would be forced to choose between maintaining her relationship with Michael's family or accepting this monetary gift that came with the requirement of making a public, detailed apology acknowledging how she'd mistreated me. The choice would reveal her true priorities and character in a way that no amount of discussion or family therapy ever could. Mrs. Wellington wanted to meet me in person to finalize the arrangement, but more importantly, to apologize on behalf of her family for the pain Mrs. Harrison had caused through what she termed shameful, disgraceful behavior that reflects poorly on our family's values. The meeting took place at Mrs. Wellington's estate the following Saturday, and walking through those imposing iron gates felt like entering a completely different universe where different rules applied and different values held sway. The house was everything I'd imagined based on movies and magazines, massive stone walls covered with ivy that had been growing for decades, gardens that looked like they belonged in European castles, and a circular driveway lined with luxury cars that cost more than most people's homes. Uniformed staff moved quietly in the background, tending to details I couldn't even identify, their presence so subtle and professional that wealth seemed to maintain itself through invisible hands. But Mrs. Wellington herself was a complete surprise that shattered every preconception I'd formed. Elegant, but genuinely warm, wealthy but completely unpretentious, and visibly horrified by her granddaughter's treatment of me rather than defensive about family behavior. She greeted me at the front door personally instead of having staff do it, served tea in delicate china cups while apologizing repeatedly for Mrs. Harrison's conduct, and explained that she'd clearly failed to instill proper values despite providing every advantage money could buy. Money should enhance relationships, not destroy them, she said firmly, her blue eyes blazing with conviction born from 8 decades of experience. What my granddaughter did to you is absolutely unforgivable, and what your daughter allowed to happen is deeply disappointing. But perhaps we can still salvage something meaningful from this mess and use it as a learning experience for everyone involved. The contract Mrs. Wellington presented was thorough and legally binding, with clauses that protected everyone involved while ensuring that justice would be served and lessons would be learned. Mrs. Harrison would indeed lose access to her trust fund for exactly 12 months, during which time she'd need to support herself through actual employment rather than inherited wealth, learning firsthand what financial pressure and budgeting meant for ordinary families. Sarah would receive an ultimatum that couldn't be ignored or postponed. Accept the $50,000 gift that came with the non-negotiable requirement of making a public apology to me, acknowledging specifically how her behavior had been hurtful and wrong, or maintain her marriage to Michael while forgoing any financial support from either family for 1 full year. The money wasn't meant to buy forgiveness, Mrs. Wellington explained carefully, but to demonstrate that my decades of sacrifice and love had measurable value that couldn't be dismissed with $10 clearance items or treated as less important than social climbing. Her legal team had already drafted ironclad documents to ensure the arrangement couldn't be challenged, modified, or circumvented by anyone who might feel entitled to different treatment or special exceptions. The papers sat on her mahogany desk like instruments of justice, waiting only for my signature to set everything in motion. Mrs. Wellington watched my face carefully as I read through each clause, clearly hoping I would accept, but prepared to respect whatever decision I made about my own dignity and family relationships. Mrs. Harrison's reaction to losing her trust fund was everything Mrs. Wellington had predicted and more. A masterclass in how quickly entitlement crumbles when faced with actual consequences. Within hours of the bank accounts being frozen and credit cards being canceled, she was calling Sarah in an absolute panic, demanding immediate answers and accountability for a situation she'd created entirely through her own arrogance and manipulation. The woman who'd been so supremely confident in her financial superiority suddenly faced the terrifying prospect of paying rent with actual earned income, buying groceries within a budget, managing household expenses, and making choices between competing priorities like the rest of us ordinary mortals did every single day. Her first instinct was to blame Sarah for not managing your mother properly and failing to control your family's behavior, as if I were a pet that needed better training rather than a human being deserving of respect. But when Sarah tried to defend me and explain that the situation was fundamentally about fairness and dignity, Mrs. Harrison's true colors emerged with startling, ugly clarity. She accused me of being manipulative and vindictive, apparently completely unable to comprehend that actions have natural consequences even when you have money, that treating people poorly eventually catches up with you regardless of your bank balance. The phone calls between Sarah and Michael grew increasingly hostile and strained as Mrs. Harrison demanded that Sarah choose immediately between preserving their marriage and maintaining any kind of relationship with me whatsoever. Sarah's choice came in the form of a handwritten letter delivered to my duplex on a Tuesday morning, written in her familiar handwriting, but carrying words I'd never expected to read from the daughter I'd raised. The envelope was expensive stationery, the kind Mrs. Harrison probably insisted on for important correspondence, but the contents were pure Sarah, emotional, honest, and surprisingly mature. She was choosing Michael and their marriage, but not for the reasons I'd feared or the financial security I'd expected her to prioritize. Instead, she explained that she finally understood what she'd become and was determined to earn back both families' respect through her own efforts rather than relying on inherited money or social connections to smooth her path. The letter contained the most heartfelt apology I'd received in years, acknowledging specifically how much pain she'd caused through her recent behavior and accepting full responsibility for choices that had damaged our relationship. I need to prove that I can love both my husband's family and my own mother without using money as a substitute for genuine affection, she wrote, in words that sounded like the daughter I'd raised rather than the stranger she'd become. Michael and I will make our marriage work together or not at all, but never again at the expense of your dignity or our relationship. Enclosed with the letter was a check for $1,500, money she'd earned from working extra hours at her marketing job rather than relying on Michael's family wealth or expecting handouts from anyone. The $50,000 from Mrs. Wellington appeared in my bank account like a warm hug from the universe, but more importantly, it represented something I'd thought was lost forever. Validation that my love and sacrifice had actual, measurable value that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. For the first time in years, I felt wealthy, not just financially, but emotionally, knowing that someone with wisdom and experience had recognized my worth and been willing to invest in my future when my own daughter had written me off for the price of clearance socks. I used the first portion to pay off the mortgage on my duplex entirely, ensuring I'd never again worry about having a safe place to live or lose sleep over rent payments during slow tipping seasons. The relief of true housing security felt almost physical, like a weight lifting off my chest that I'd carried so long I'd forgotten what breathing freely felt like. Another substantial portion went toward enrolling in online courses to finish the bachelor's degree I'd abandoned when Sarah was born. A dream I'd put aside for motherhood, but could now pursue for myself without apology or guilt. The rest I saved for emergencies and small luxuries I denied myself for decades. Fresh flowers every week instead of plastic ones. Books from the bookstore instead of the library sale table, and the occasional dinner out somewhere nicer than the diner where I worked. But the real gift wasn't the money itself. It was the knowledge that someone had recognized my worth as a human being and been willing to invest in my future and dreams. Mrs. Harrison's year of financial independence became a harsh but necessary education in reality that changed her perspective more dramatically than anyone could have predicted. Without her trust fund cushion providing security and confidence, she had to take an entry-level position at a marketing firm where she worked alongside people exactly like Sarah. Educated but not wealthy, ambitious but not entitled, hard-working but not privileged by birth or family connections. The experience of budgeting for groceries, clipping coupons, shopping for clothes at Target instead of Nordstrom, and choosing between dinner out and new shoes gave her insights into daily life that she'd never possessed despite her expensive private school education and graduate degree. Her new co-workers were kind but completely unimpressed by her family connections or social status. And for the first time in her adult life, she had to prove her value through effort, creativity, and collaboration rather than inheritance or intimidation. The woman who'd once dismissed me as just a waitress found herself deeply grateful when those same working-class colleagues shared their homemade lunches, offered rides when her car needed repairs she couldn't afford, and included her in their modest social activities without expecting her to reciprocate with expensive entertainment. By month 6 of her forced employment, she was calling my duplex to apologize, not because anyone had forced her to, but because she finally, genuinely understood the damage her arrogance and class prejudice had caused to real people with real feelings. The phone call from Mrs. Harrison came on a Thursday evening in October, her voice shaky with nerves and what sounded like genuine remorse rather than calculated social maneuvering. She'd been working at her marketing job for 7 months, living in a modest apartment she could afford on her actual salary, and apparently learning lessons that 3 years of being Michael's mother and trying to control Sarah hadn't taught her about humility and human dignity. "Mrs. Morrison," she began, using my name with respect for the first time since I'd known her, "I need to apologize for my behavior and ask if there's any possible way to repair the damage I've caused to your family." Her voice was different. Softer, more uncertain, lacking the commanding tone that had always made me feel like hired help being tolerated in my own daughter's life. She explained that living without her trust fund safety net had shown her the daily challenges faced by people who work for their money rather than inheriting it, and she was genuinely ashamed of how she'd treated me as inferior simply because our circumstances were different through no moral failing of my own. The apology was specific and detailed, acknowledging each slight and dismissal, each time she'd made me feel unwelcome or unwanted in my own daughter's life, each occasion when she'd used her wealth as a weapon to establish dominance rather than build relationships. She'd learned that financial security was a privilege, not a right, and that judging people by their bank accounts rather than their character was not just wrong but destructive to everyone involved. Sarah had been watching Mrs. Harrison's transformation with amazement and growing respect, seeing qualities in her mother-in-law that financial privilege had previously hidden beneath layers of entitlement and social anxiety. Michael was initially resistant to his mother's changed circumstances, worried about their family's reputation and his own comfort level. But gradually, he began to appreciate the woman she was becoming, without the corrupting influence of unearned wealth providing easy solutions to every problem. Their smaller apartment was furnished with pieces they'd chosen together at regular furniture stores and paid for with their combined salaries, creating a home that reflected their actual tastes and needs rather than what expensive interior designers thought would impress their social circle. Mrs. Harrison was learning to cook substantial meals rather than just supervising caterers. Sarah was helping with household budgets and bill management, and both women were finding joy in simple pleasures that money couldn't buy, like grocery shopping together while comparing prices, finding free entertainment around the city, and building relationships through shared effort rather than financial obligations or social expectations. The stress had initially strained their relationship, But ultimately, it had stripped away the superficial elements and revealed the genuine respect and affection that had been buried under layers of financial complexity and social maneuvering. They were becoming real friends rather than just family members connected by marriage and obligation. The invitation that arrived in November was handwritten on simple stationery, a far cry from the expensive engraved cards Mrs. Harrison used to send for formal occasions. Sarah, Michael, and Mrs. Harrison were asking if I'd like to join them for Thanksgiving dinner at their modest apartment, and the gesture felt like forgiveness wrapped in turkey and stuffing, seasoned with genuine warmth rather than social obligation. It was the first time in over a year that Sarah had included me in their holiday plans, and more importantly, it was the first invitation that felt like it came from love rather than duty. Mrs. Harrison had added her own note to the invitation, expressing sincere hope that we could start fresh and build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than the mistakes and misunderstandings of the past. They wanted to cook dinner together, all four of us working in their small kitchen, creating new traditions that honored both families without the weight of financial comparison or social competition hanging over every interaction. The apartment couldn't compete with the elegant dining rooms where they'd previously celebrated holidays with professional caterers and expensive wine, but it promised something more valuable, authentic connection between people who'd learned to value each other properly. The invitation specifically requested that I bring my famous pumpkin pie recipe, the one Sarah had loved as a child but hadn't asked for in years, suggesting that she was ready to embrace her roots rather than hide from them. Thanksgiving dinner in their modest apartment turned out to be more meaningful and joyful than any elaborate celebration we'd shared in restaurants or country clubs over the previous few years. Mrs. Harrison proved to be surprisingly skilled at cooking traditional dishes, having learned by necessity rather than hobby during her months of financial independence, and she moved around the small kitchen with efficient grace that spoke of genuine practice rather than just following recipes once or twice. Sarah handled the side dishes with the same attention to detail she brought to everything she truly cared about, and I contributed not just my pumpkin pie, but also the green bean casserole that had been a family tradition since Sarah was small. We worked together for hours, laughing at small disasters like oversalted gravy and celebrating tiny victories like perfectly risen dinner rolls, building something together that felt more valuable and lasting than any expensive gift could ever be. The conversation flowed naturally without the underlying tension that had poisoned our previous interactions, and I found myself genuinely liking the woman Mrs. Harrison had become when she wasn't trying to prove her superiority through spending money or demonstrating her social connections. Michael carved the turkey with pride. Sarah set the table with mismatched dishes that somehow looked perfect, and Mrs. Harrison lit candles that created warm light instead of just expensive ambiance. The meal itself was absolutely delicious, but the real feast was the conversation that continued long after the dishes were cleared and the leftover turkey was safely stored in the refrigerator. Mrs. Harrison talked about her marketing job with genuine enthusiasm rather than the resigned tolerance I'd expected, describing colleagues who'd become actual friends and projects that challenged her creativity in ways her trust fund lifestyle never had. Sarah shared stories about clients whose small businesses she was helping grow through innovative marketing strategies, finding deep satisfaction in work that made a real difference in people's lives rather than simply generating income for its own sake. Michael spoke about his own career with new appreciation for the effort required to earn rather than inherit professional success, and how his perspective on work and money had evolved through watching both his wife and mother navigate financial challenges with grace and determination. I told them about my college courses and the progress I was making toward finally earning my degree, sharing dreams I was pursuing for myself rather than sacrificing for others, and plans for a teaching career that would let me help other adults pursue their own delayed educations. For the first time in years, we were 4 adults supporting each other's growth and ambitions rather than competing for validation, resources, or attention. The cheap socks that had started this whole painful conflict seemed like ancient history, replaced by understanding and respect that couldn't be purchased at any price. Christmas brought another surprise that demonstrated just how much Mrs. Harrison had learned about meaningful gestures and the difference between expensive gifts and thoughtful ones. Instead of the usual jewelry or designer items she'd previously chosen to impress rather than delight, she gave me a beautifully framed photo collage documenting my journey through college courses over the past months. Sarah had been secretly photographing moments of my educational journey. Me studying at the kitchen table with textbooks spread around coffee cups, walking across campus with my backpack, celebrating small achievements like passing difficult exams, and sharing them with Mrs. Harrison, who'd assembled them into a visual story of determination and personal growth that honored my efforts rather than dismissing them. The frame itself was simple and inexpensive, clearly chosen for its meaning rather than its price tag. But the thoughtfulness behind the gift made it more precious than any diamond bracelet could ever be. Accompanying the photo collage was a handwritten letter explaining how my example of pursuing education despite obstacles had inspired Mrs. Harrison to consider returning to school herself, not because financial necessity demanded it, but because learning had intrinsic value beyond monetary reward. She'd enrolled in evening classes toward a teaching certificate, wanting to work with adult literacy programs rather than simply writing checks to charitable organizations. My gift to them was equally symbolic, but far more practical. A complete set of matching coffee mugs I'd made in the ceramics class I'd finally had time and money to take. Each mug was hand-thrown and fired, glazed with colors that reminded me of their apartment's cheerful decor. Warm blues and sunny yellows that spoke of hope and new beginnings. They were slightly imperfect in the way that handmade items always are, showing the individual character that mass production could never replicate. But they were sturdy and beautiful in their uniqueness and imperfection. Sarah held hers with the same wonder she'd shown as a child receiving handmade presents, turning it in her hands to examine every detail of the glaze pattern and running her fingers along the rim I'd carefully smoothed. Mrs. Harrison traced the subtle variations in color with obvious appreciation, thanking me repeatedly for creating something so personal and meaningful rather than simply purchasing something expensive and impersonal. Michael admired the craftsmanship with genuine interest, asking questions about the firing process and glazing techniques that showed he valued the skill and time invested in creating his mug. The mugs represented dozens of hours of learning, practicing, making mistakes, and gradually improving, much like the relationships we were rebuilding through patience, forgiveness, and genuine effort to understand each other. They promised to use them every morning for their coffee, creating a daily reminder of our newfound connection, and the truth that the most valuable gifts are made with love rather than bought with money. Mrs. Wellington's decision about reinstating the trust fund came with carefully crafted conditions that ensured Mrs. Harrison had truly learned the intended lessons from her year of financial independence, rather than simply enduring it until she could return to her previous lifestyle. The monthly allowance was permanently reduced to encourage continued employment and personal growth, and future access to family money required annual proof of charitable giving and meaningful community service, rather than just social obligations or tax-advantageous donations. Mrs. Harrison embraced these requirements with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, having discovered that contributing to others' welfare provided satisfaction and purpose that passive wealth consumption never could deliver. She volunteered 15 hours weekly at the Adult Literacy Center, where I'd begun teaching part-time, working with students who were pursuing their GEDs or learning English as a second language. The work was more rewarding than any country club activity she'd previously pursued, giving her genuine connections with people whose stories inspired rather than bored her. Her relationship with money had fundamentally changed from entitlement and consumption to stewardship and purpose, and she frequently credited her year of living like normal people with teaching her lessons that no amount of inherited wealth could have provided. The money was still there when needed, but it served her values now, rather than defining them or separating her from people she'd learned to genuinely respect and care about. Sarah's marketing career flourished as she focused on work that aligned with her values rather than simply impressing people with expensive lifestyle choices or social connections. Her firm promoted her to senior account manager within 6 months, recognizing both her creative talents and her newly developed ability to connect authentically with clients from diverse backgrounds, a skill she'd gained through learning to value people regardless of their financial circumstances or social status. She started a scholarship program for children of service workers, using her professional network and marketing expertise to create opportunities for kids whose parents worked in restaurants, retail, healthcare support, and other jobs that kept society functioning but rarely received public recognition or adequate compensation. The program was funded through a combination of her own savings, donations from clients who'd been moved by her presentations about economic dignity, and matching funds from her company's corporate social responsibility budget. Sarah found deep satisfaction in helping families like ours access educational opportunities that could change entire generational trajectories, and the work gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing from her previous focus on social climbing and material accumulation. She'd discovered that success felt more meaningful when it was shared with others rather than hoarded for personal advantage. The second Mother's Day arrived with anticipation rather than dread, beginning with a joint phone call from Sarah, Michael, and Mrs. Harrison asking if they could take me to brunch at Murphy's Diner, the same small restaurant where I'd worked for years before my teaching career began. The location was Mrs. Harrison's suggestion, chosen deliberately to honor my work history rather than hide from it or pretend it hadn't happened, and we spent the morning surrounded by my former colleagues and regular customers who welcomed me back like family. The walls were covered with photos documenting the neighborhood's evolution over decades, and I found myself sharing stories about the community I'd served and the people I'd come to know through countless breakfast shifts and late-night conversations. My Mother's Day gift was presented in a leather portfolio that Mrs. Harrison had chosen personally, copies of all my college transcripts showing my steady progress toward graduation, a timeline documenting my academic achievements over the past year, and a formal letter of acceptance to the Master's in Education program I'd applied to with their encouragement and support. Inside the portfolio was also a check for $5,000, not from Mrs. Harrison's trust fund, but from money all three of them had saved from their own paychecks specifically to support my continued education and career development. The portfolio itself was engraved with a simple but powerful message that brought tears to my eyes. To the woman who taught us that love is measured in sacrifice, not spending, and that worth is determined by character, not wealth. Mrs. Harrison's gift to her own mother that year represented a complete transformation in her understanding of what constituted meaningful giving. Instead of the usual expensive jewelry or luxury items she'd previously chosen to fulfill social obligations, she presented Mrs. Wellington with a bound collection of handwritten letters from Literacy Center students describing how Mrs. Harrison's tutoring had changed their lives in concrete, measurable ways. The elderly woman wept openly while reading testimonials from adults who could now read bedtime stories to their children, help with homework assignments, fill out job applications independently, and navigate the world with dignity and confidence they'd never possessed before. One letter was from a 50-year-old construction worker who'd hidden his illiteracy for decades. Another came from a young mother who could finally read medicine labels and dosing instructions for her sick child. Mrs. Harrison had discovered that her grandmother valued impact over expense, service over status, and had crafted a gift that honored both their family's wealth and their responsibility to use it wisely for the benefit of others. Mrs. Wellington was so moved by the letters that she immediately doubled her annual charitable contributions and asked Mrs. Harrison to help her identify other meaningful causes that could benefit from their family's resources and influence. The gift cost almost nothing in monetary terms, but was priceless in its demonstration of how Mrs. Harrison's values had evolved. My original socks from that first painful Mother's Day still occupied a place in my dresser drawer. Not because I'd grown sentimental about them, but because they'd become a powerful reminder of how far we'd all traveled from that morning of hurt feelings and misplaced priorities. They remain cheap, still beige, still emblematic of thoughtlessness disguised as obligation and duty performed without love or consideration. But now, they also represented the catalyst that had forced honest conversations none of us had wanted to have, necessary changes that had improved all our lives, and ultimately stronger relationships built on genuine respect rather than financial obligation or social convenience. Every time I saw them folded among my newer, better clothing, items I could now afford thanks to my teaching salary and Mrs. Wellington's investment in my future, I remembered not just the hurt they'd originally caused, but also the incredible growth they'd sparked in every member of our family. Sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as disappointments, wrapped in pain that forces us to examine our priorities and relationships more honestly than comfort ever could. Sometimes what feels like rejection is actually the universe's way of demanding that we recognize our own worth and refuse to accept less than we deserve from the people who claim to love us. The duplex that had once felt like a symbol of my limitations and failures now felt like home in ways I'd never experienced during all my years of financial struggle and social insecurity. I'd used part of Mrs. Wellington's gift to paint every room in colors that made me happy. Cheerful yellows in the kitchen, calming blues in the bedroom, warm greens in the living room that reminded me of the gardens I'd always dreamed of having. Local artwork covered the walls, pieces I'd purchased from struggling artists whose work spoke to me rather than expensive prints chosen to impress visitors I rarely had. The windowsills overflowed with plants that thrived under my newfound attention, and the confidence that came with knowing I could afford to replace them if they died. The mortgage was completely paid off, but more importantly, the space reflected my growing self-worth and the peace that comes with knowing you're exactly where you belong. Sarah, Michael, and Mrs. Harrison visited regularly now, not out of duty or social obligation, but because they genuinely enjoyed spending time in the warm, welcoming environment I'd created through my own choices and efforts. We cooked meals together, worked on homework assignments for my graduate classes, and planned their upcoming vacation to Italy, a trip they were taking to celebrate both Mrs. Harrison's successful completion of her teaching certification and Sarah's promotion to regional marketing director. The neighborhood itself had also become more meaningful, as I'd stopped seeing it through the lens of what it lacked compared to wealthier areas, and started appreciating what it offered in terms of community and authentic relationships. Mrs. Chen remained a close friend and confidant, and together we'd organized a monthly book club that met in my living room to discuss everything from classic literature to contemporary memoirs and self-help books. The group included women from various backgrounds: teachers, nurses, retirees, working mothers, and small business owners, who brought diverse perspectives that enriched every conversation and challenged everyone's assumptions about life, relationships, and success. Mrs. Harrison had joined our discussions several times, initially intimidated by the intellectual engagement, but gradually contributing insights that surprised everyone, including herself. She'd grown from someone who'd never had to think deeply about anything into a woman who asked thoughtful questions and shared personal experiences that revealed genuine growth and wisdom. These gatherings reminded me that meaningful community could be built anywhere people chose to invest time and emotional energy in relationships rather than simply tolerating each other's presence. Some of life's greatest pleasures, stimulating conversation, shared laughter, mutual support during difficult times, cost nothing more than attention and genuine care for others' well-being. My graduation ceremony in May was attended by a cheering section that would have made any mother proud and deeply grateful for the support system she'd built through years of patience, forgiveness, and careful relationship building. Sarah, Michael, Mrs. Harrison, Janet, Mrs. Chen, and even Mrs. Wellington had all driven to the university campus to celebrate my achievement, filling an entire row in the auditorium and applauding loudly when my name was called. The bachelor's degree I received represented far more than academic success. It was tangible proof that dreams deferred are not dreams denied, that it's never too late to invest in yourself and pursue goals that matter regardless of what others think or expect. It demonstrated that the most meaningful accomplishments often come when we stop seeking approval from others and start pursuing purpose for ourselves, driven by internal motivation rather than external validation. Mrs. Harrison took hundreds of photos throughout the ceremony, her enthusiasm genuine and infectious as she documented every moment of my achievement. Sarah cried through the entire event, her tears reflecting pride, regret, and joy all mixed together in recognition of how much we'd both grown. Mrs. Wellington presented me with an engraved fountain pen and a leather-bound journal, tools for the teaching career that lay ahead and symbols of the intellectual journey I'd completed despite numerous obstacles. The celebration dinner afterward took place at Murphy's Diner, where I'd worked for so many years. But this time I was the honored guest rather than the server, surrounded by people who'd learned to value my mind as much as my heart and my achievements as much as my sacrifices. The teaching position I accepted that fall was at the community college's Adult Education Center, working with students who were pursuing their own delayed dreams while juggling work responsibilities, family obligations, and financial constraints that made every semester a significant sacrifice. Many were single mothers like I'd been, recent immigrants learning English while working multiple jobs, or people who'd left school early to support their families and were now trying to build better futures for themselves and their children. Their stories resonated deeply with my own experience of deferring dreams, making sacrifices, and fighting for educational opportunities that others took for granted. Mrs. Harrison volunteered 15 hours weekly to help with career counseling, using her business background and professional connections to review resumes, practice interview skills, and connect students with employment opportunities that matched their newly acquired qualifications. Sarah developed comprehensive marketing materials to promote the program throughout the community, attracting both students who needed services and local businesses willing to provide funding or job opportunities for graduates. Together, we created a support system that honored the dignity of every student's educational journey while providing practical assistance for achieving career goals that had seemed impossible when they started. The work was challenging, but incredibly rewarding, giving all of us purpose that went beyond our own personal success and happiness. The anniversary of that first painful Mother's Day passed quietly, marked not by dramatic gestures or expensive gifts, but by a simple family dinner where we shared updates about our respective projects and made plans for summer adventures that would create memories rather than demonstrate wealth. The conversation flowed easily between Mrs. Harrison's descriptions of her latest volunteer work and teaching experiences, Sarah's excitement about expanding her scholarship program to serve more families in need, Michael's pride in his wife's professional achievements and community involvement, and my stories about students who were discovering hidden talents and capabilities they'd never known they possessed. We were four adults who'd learned to support each other's growth and celebrate individual achievements rather than competing for validation, attention, or resources. The evening felt like the natural conclusion of a difficult but transformative chapter in our family's history and the beginning of a much more hopeful story built on mutual respect rather than financial obligations or social expectations. No one mentioned the cheap socks that had started everything, but we all understood intuitively how far we'd traveled from that morning of hurt feelings, misplaced priorities, and relationships damaged by money and social climbing. The growth had been painful but necessary, teaching lessons that comfort and wealth never could have provided. As I sit here now, preparing for another Mother's Day that promises to be filled with genuine love rather than obligatory gestures or expensive substitutes for authentic caring, I reflect on the profound lessons we've all learned through this painful but ultimately transformative experience. The diamond bracelet that Mrs. Harrison had originally encouraged Sarah to purchase sits largely unworn in a jewelry box. Its sparkle dimmed by the knowledge of how much pain it had caused, while the simple coffee mug I'd made with my own hands gets daily use and brings visible joy to everyone who drinks from it. Sarah has developed a deep understanding of love as consistent action and attention rather than expensive gestures or social performances, and she demonstrates that knowledge through her thoughtful care for both her birth family and her in-laws. Mrs. Harrison has discovered that her inherited wealth, when used properly, can create positive change in the world rather than simply funding a privileged lifestyle that separated her from meaningful relationships and authentic purpose. Most importantly, I've learned that demanding respect isn't selfish or unreasonable. It's absolutely necessary for any relationship to thrive authentically rather than limping along on obligation, guilt, or financial dependence. Self-worth can't be purchased or given by others, it must be claimed and defended by the person who deserves it, regardless of what others think or prefer. The box of $10 clearance socks still occupies its place in my dresser drawer, but its meaning has been completely transformed through everything that followed that painful Mother's Day morning. What once represented thoughtless dismissal and calculated cruelty now symbolizes the moment when I finally found the courage to stand up for my own worth and refuse to accept crumbs when I deserved the whole cake of genuine love and respect. Those cheap, beige, uninspiring socks were the unexpected catalyst that led to $50,000 in recognition, a college degree earned through my own determination, a meaningful teaching career that uses my life experience to help others, and most importantly, relationships rebuilt on solid foundations of mutual respect rather than financial obligation or social convenience. Sometimes the universe delivers its most important messages through the smallest, most unlikely packages. And sometimes what feels like a devastating ending is actually the beginning of something far better than anything that came before. The socks serve as a permanent reminder that my worth as a human being isn't determined by what others choose to give me or how they decide to treat me, but by what I choose to accept from them and how I demand to be treated. I've learned to accept nothing less than genuine love, authentic respect, and treatment that reflects my true value as a mother, educator, and person who has contributed meaningfully to others' lives for decades. If you've experienced similar family dynamics where money has complicated relationships, where your contributions have been undervalued, or where people have used financial resources as weapons to establish hierarchies and control others' behavior, remember that you always have the power to change your story. It's never too late to pursue dreams that matter to you, never too late to demand better treatment from people who claim to love you, and never too late to build relationships based on genuine appreciation rather than financial convenience, social obligation, or inherited expectations. The path toward healing and authentic connection isn't always easy or comfortable, but it's always worth taking when it leads to relationships built on mutual respect, rather than power imbalances or emotional manipulation. Share your own experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you've navigated these challenging family waters and what advice you might offer to others facing similar situations with in-laws, children, or spouses who've lost sight of what really matters. Sometimes the most painful gifts force us to confront truths we've been avoiding for years. And while the journey toward healing requires courage and determination, it inevitably leads to more authentic relationships and a stronger sense of personal worth that can never again be damaged by thoughtless gestures or calculated cruelty disguised as love.